I'll introduce our panel of experts in a moment, but first I want to make two important acknowledgements. First, and very importantly, particularly as we are in NAIDOC week right at the moment, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on Kaurna land and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I always find it very appropriate when we gather together to talk about issues of importance to remember that Australia has a traditional history, a very important past of people, our Indigenous First Nations people coming together to discuss caring for community, caring for country, and we are continuing that tradition in modern Australia and we take inspiration from their example. We also need to acknowledge, I think, that we're meeting in 2020 in a pandemic, so we're meeting in a small group necessarily with all sorts of sanitation and precautions, and we acknowledge that many people are experiencing unemployment for the first time after perhaps being used to quite stable employment. We know that even prior to COVID, times were tough for very many people. Wages have been stagnating and people have experienced insecure employment, but things have certainly changed now. As I say, tonight we're going to hear from experts, perhaps challenge our own thinking and have an opportunity to ask questions. We do have an apology, which I'm sad to say we're going to start. We were hoping to hear from Paz Forgione, the director of the Anti-Poverty Network, talking to us about the impact of unemployment and the assistance and procedures that are available. But instead, we'll hear from Alex North, the coordinator of the Unemployed Workers Union, and we will be watching a short video. I have seen this talk before and I'm very much looking forward to seeing it again. We'll also be hearing from Professor Stephen Hale, Dr. Stephen Hale from Adelaide University, and also from Nick Potts, psychiatrist, who will be joining us as he rushes away from consulting at his clinic today. So first to the presentation from Alex North from the the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. This union advocates for people who are unemployed, but also for people who are trying to navigate the very complicated systems of welfare and assistance for unemployed people. So they do extend also to sole parents and other people trying to negotiate complex welfare arrangements. And at that point, I would like to hand over to Gabby to begin the talk from Alex. Thank you very much. And it is my absolute pleasure now to invite Dr. Nick Potts to join us at the head table. Thank you, Nick. So, hello.
Hey.
Welcome. Thank you for rushing away from work to join us. So, Dr. Nick Potts is a psychiatrist, does spend most of his time working in private practice, and also has a strong body of research mainly on dealing with anxiety disorders. Nick was, along with Chris Edwards, was the co-founder of what became the Centre for Treatment of Anxiety Disorders, a public clinic, the first of its kind in South Australia, to combine the services of psychiatry and psychology. Tonight he's going to be giving us the benefit of his experience working with people and describing their experiences through unemployment, and also talking about some research about why employment matters and the impact it has on people's mental health. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you. So I can put this down. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Without this?
Better with it.
Better with it?
We
Okay.
do have I should say, we do have a YouTube audience as well.
Oh,
because
okay.
we're meeting in a COVID-safe group, so
Ah, gotcha.
they probably need to hear more.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, I don't want to delay too long because obviously I've written more than I expected.
I just thought I would start with mentioning a name that's going to come up a few times. It's actually quite relevant to the concept of CTAD, Centre for the Treatment of Anxiety and Depression. Although I'm from Adelaide, I did my psychiatry training in the US for a variety of reasons. And one of the interesting things they do in the US that I think is quite brilliant, that we need to do more of here, is much greater collaboration between psychiatrists and psychologists. So you're going to hear me today talk about a psychologist I'm going to mention a few times by the name of Martin Seligman, who's kind of a demigod in my world. He's actually come out to Australia on 2 occasions that I'm aware of. Kevin Rudd had him come out and spend a few weeks dealing with the Department of Education in, I think, about 2010. And then South Australia, you might remember we had thinkers in residence that came out for 6 months. We actually could only afford Martin Seligman for 2 weeks. Obviously he's high demand. Everything he earns goes back into his research, so he's not getting wealthy off it. But he is a gentleman who's devoted his life to studying mental health. He spent the first half of his career studying why people get depressed. And he's come up with a model that you're going to hear me talk about called learned hopelessness or helplessness, which is just one of the foundation stones that we now understand as to why people get depressed. And if you want to think about it, I think one of the most simplest examples is think about indigenous populations all around the world. Think about indigenous Aborigines here in Australia, indigenous Native Americans. One of my favorite TED Talks is entitled Native American Indians, Prisoners of War. And literally the concept of being a prisoner of war for 8 generations now. And after 8 generations, well, why would you make an effort in life? Because the deck is so stacked against you, you live in a world of absolute hopelessness and helplessness. So that's, on its surface, the basic concept of a learned helplessness. But you can demonstrate it very simply with a rat. You can put a rat in a cage, lock the door, give it an electrical shock. The rat gets quite jumpy, not because there's a cat there. You wait a few more minutes, you give it another shock, the rat jumps, quite on edge. Do it one more time, and then you do this interesting maneuver. You actually open up the cage, and the rat just sits there. And you deliver another shock, and the rat no longer gets worked up. It just accepts its fate and takes another shock and doesn't even try to leave the cage. And this is the model about learned hopelessness and how, like rats, human beings get to the point where you just give up because you feel the world is helpless. There is no option, no light at the end of the tunnel. I do kind of want to focus in this talk a bit on the current COVID crisis, but I thought I would like to give it an important perspective because we're living in an economic crisis unlike any other crisis that I can think of, at least in the last 100 years. So I want to give you this background, and again, that partly involves Seligman, a bit about what do we know about mental health, unemployment, and economic crises, and then the last little bit touch on, is there anything to feel positive about, or is it all doom and gloom? So one of the first areas, when we think about how we got to where we are today, I think there really was a powerful, I should say, transition in the West post-World War II. And that really was, and you hear Warren Buffett talk a fair bit about this, especially in a country like America, but also in Western Europe, here in Australia. You saw companies that had always been family companies transition into the concept of corporations. And with that, there became a loss of what is generally called family values. And in this kind of 60s and 70s, we saw the massive growth of what we call corporation values, where corporations no longer concern themselves with individuals, but they concern themselves with shareholders. And that has had a profound impact upon how corporations interact with people in society. Secondly, in the 60s, but especially the 70s and 80s, we had an economy in the West that was really struggling, and you saw for the first time the rise of the 2-income family. And this really began the fragmentation, I believe, of the family unit, which I think is incredibly underappreciated at its impact upon society. And that really is the beginning of what I might call the erosion of social connection. And that sadly even began within the family unit, not even within our community, but within the homes. If we even look at the concept of house design post-World War II to the year 2000, post-World War II, immediately you had a 2 or 3 bedroom house, a living room, a dining room, a bathroom. Nowadays there's 5 bedrooms, there's a parent's retreat, there's a kid's retreat. Every kid's got their own room, they sit in there, and no families connect. So again, on many levels, society's changed a lot in those 60 years. One of my favorite psychiatrists, a German by the name of Fritz Perls in 1960, made an incredible prediction. And that is, he said, for the first time in the West, we have the opportunity to live a life based on pleasure. We don't have to live a life based on obligation or duty. And he said, look, it's very tempting, it's very seductive to choose the path of pleasure. But let me warn you, if you go down this path, you will become very phobic of pain. And here's the real problem with that. Life is going to be painful. And importantly, within pain, you can potentially also find growth. Growth as individuals, but also growth as a community. But we've really struggled with that concept. And that's reflected in something that I'll mention a little bit later on. Then I just want to go and just mention the idea that really in the 80s and 90s, one of the big shifts we saw as the family broke down, and as the community began to break down, we saw this shift from a community focus to a me focus. And it's like, what's going to happen to me? What's my life going to be about? And people really started disconnecting from communities and became more and more self-focused. And that has become one of the major drivers, I believe, in the concept of why we're suffering more and more from mental health. That's kind of reflected in a magnificent book by a gentleman by the name of Johann Hari, who's written 2 great books in the last 10 years. One called Chasing the Screen, about why addiction has become so large in our world. But the second one is called Lost Connections, about why we're becoming more depressed and anxious. And it's really based on the concept that our social connectiveness is just falling apart. The idea that, if you go back 20 years ago, if you suffered a personal crisis, say you became homeless, and you were asked the question, how many people, friends, would take you in? That number used to be about 2. In recent studies in the UK, that number now has fallen below 1. So there are people out there in time of crisis that literally have no one that they can turn to. As I said, times are becoming more difficult. In the 80s, we hit the 24-hour news cycle. And that may sound like a trivial matter, but that was huge because it's made everyone paranoid. Paranoid that we live in this world that's incredibly dangerous. It meant parents now just over-parent, helicopter parent. Everyone's just afraid there's terrorists and terrible people all around us. Also in the 80s, as Seligman points out, there was a massive shift in our educational system. And this was not for the good. And this was an educational system that started in the US, but worked its way around the West, which really had a foundation on the concept of self-esteem. And what Seligman would argue, if we focus too much on self-esteem and we focus too much on rewarding people just for showing up, we give them foundations that are based of sand. And really, when faced with real life, they crumble very quickly. So what we need to do when we raise kids, when we raise communities, when we deal with kids in school, we have to have honest conversations with them, give them realistic feedback. That's not being cruel, but that's getting them to understand no one's born a great football player, no one's born a great cricket player, no one's born a great scholar. But if you work hard and you put in the effort, you'll increase the chance. As I said, these times are becoming more ominous, and the statistics I think that really bear that out is, by the mid-90s, we in psychiatry were feeling pretty chuffed with ourselves. Suicide rates in the West were falling. We had magnificent drugs. But by 1996, 1997, the tide turned. And in the last 25 years in the West, in an incredibly striking fashion, suicide rates have increased 30%. And suicide, completed suicide, has generally been the domain of males between the ages of 15 and 45. But we're now seeing that rate rise dramatically within females and amongst all age groups. So really, we're not doing well as a community. We're actually going backward at quite a significant rate. You know, despite this, in the year 2000, the World Health Organization put out a report basically telling the world, beware 2020, and we're in that year now. The two biggest issues that will be facing the world globally, heart disease and depression and suicide. And really, every Western country has failed to prepare for that. And we're seeing that being reflected in these massive suicide rates. The stat I think that really speaks to that is, for the first time in US history, out of the last 5 years, the average life expectancy of an American has fallen 4 out of the last 5 years, which is a statistic beyond belief. And the two biggest reasons for that are opiate overdoses and completed suicides. So what we're seeing is society is unable to tolerate emotional pain, but also physical pain. Despite the best painkillers ever developed, despite the best antidepressants, we're really falling well behind. And that really implicates, I think, a lot of the psychosocial factors in regards why people are really struggling. So we then come up to the COVID times, and really I think as COVID's hitting us this year, we're starting well behind the eight ball. We're more depressed, we're more anxious, we're more vulnerable, we're more susceptible. And then we have a factor that I think most people have kind of really forgotten about, and that is the bushfires, which hit us incredibly hard. And I can tell you, in February, my workload and demands for my workload increased dramatically. And there's some evidence, while that's really made COVID a lot harder for some of us, in some ways it may have actually protected us by killing our tourist industry and thus decreasing the amount of tourists bringing COVID into this country. So it's got its pros and cons. The last thing I'll mention is the global financial crisis 2008. I don't know, I'm 58 years old. A few people in the room might be similar age to me. We all occasionally look at the stock market. I think it's important to notice the stock market really has never gotten above pre-global financial crisis times. So we're still yet to fully economically recover from that, and we now are hit with this other wave. So again, it's a bit like the climate change. The 1 in 100-year storms, they're not happening every 100 years anymore, are they? They're happening every 10 years, every 5 years. And we're starting to see that for the concept of mental health. From the global financial crisis, we did learn one very important stat, and that is, as unemployment rose, and in the US, one of the figures they quote is it went from 4% to 5.8%. Within a year of that unemployment rate rising, you saw a 22% increase in completed suicides for males, and staggeringly, a 12 to 13% increase for completed suicides in females. One of the first times we saw a surge in females taking their lives. So now kind of onto the concept of, well, what do we know about mental health? Well, and the concept of unemployment. Well, we know that people who have mental health problems, and the most common ones are depression and anxiety, that when they hit financial crises, they struggle very badly. They're very high likelihood of having a relapse of their mental health or an exacerbation. They're also significantly much more likely to become unemployed. Factors that relate to this include the fact they have an exacerbation of their mental illness. We know that people with depression and anxiety are not very good at going to their GPs and seeking treatment. Most depression and anxiety is undertreated. So these individuals are very unlikely to go to GPs, get sick certificates, because they have a lot of embarrassment, a lot of guilt, a lot of shame. And so they're much more likely to lose their jobs very quickly. We then know that they jump very quickly into the unemployment rate. And if old enough, and I've seen this in a number of my patients, in their mid to late 50s, if they can, they opt for quick retirement. And they'd rather a retirement on a very meager wage than try and deal with the workforce, because it just feels so overwhelming and, you know, understandably hopeless, in that we don't see a lot of jobs being dished out to people who are 58 years old or, you know, 60 or 62. We then know, as you become unemployed, even if you've got a mental illness or you don't, that again, without a history of mental illness, you're more likely to become mentally unwell. And this, now we get go back to Seligman. What he would describe is you initially become very anxious. I've lost my job, my finances are dwindling, my assets are dwindling, I've got mouths to feed, bills to pay. And as this prolongs over 3, 6, 12 months, that initial anxiety morphs into depression. And the reason for that morphine is about the concept of hopelessness. Because the longer the kind of economic crisis goes on, the greater the level of hopelessness. And this is why we have one of the most telling stats that goes back to when I was a medical student in the late 80s, that if you have an individual who's been unemployed for more than 2 years, the odds of them getting back to work is very low. And it's also one of the reasons why we see a significant increase in suicide rates in people who have been unemployed for longer than 12 to 24 months. Besides developing the anxiety and depression, one of the other big factors that we don't talk about here in Australia, I must admit, having spent a lot of my life in the US, although originally from here, I think here in Australia we have, and I have to be careful saying this in a pub, somewhat unhealthy relationship with alcohol. And you know, one of my favorite statistics from a few years ago was looking at the number of ambulances called out in metropolitan Melbourne in the midst of Australia's amphetamine crisis. And in metropolitan Melbourne, the stats were 6 ambulances a day were being called out for heroin-related disorders, 5 a day for marijuana-related disorders, 4 a day for amphetamine-related disorders, and the number for alcohol was 34 a day. And one of the things we got to think about is when people are suffering from mental health and there's unemployment and there's hopelessness, one of the first things we turn to is alcohol. And it's been well reported, which I'm actually really pleased to see this time, that there has been a significant consumption in alcohol. One of the things we also need to think about when we see that is, as you increase alcohol, you also increase domestic violence. And that becomes a major factor that, again, we probably don't talk enough about. And when we talk about domestic violence, I think one of the factors that we really struggle to talk about is the impact of domestic violence on children. Now, there's a wonderful pediatrician in America, in San Francisco, by the name of Nadine Burke-Harris. And she is the voice of reason, I believe, in America, and when it comes to pediatric psychiatry. And if you know anything about American pediatric psychiatry, the amount of amphetamines prescribed to kids is staggering. The number of children that are called attention deficit, hyperactivity, oppositional defiant, conduct disordered. And as Nadine Burke-Harris is kind of really leading the charge, what she's pointing out is it's very easy to point the finger at kids when you have a family in crisis. But really, instead of labeling these children as having mental illnesses, we need to dig a little bit deeper, and we need to look at the family, and we need to look at issues like unemployment, like substance abuse, like domestic violence. Now, we used to do that in the 50s and 60s, but as psychiatry has gone more to medication models, a lot of the psychosocial model has really fallen by the wayside. And again, that's a real tragedy for mental health services. You know, the good news is there are some positives for people who become unemployed. And again, this relates to the second part of Martin Seligman's work in his career. And kind of in the late 80s, Seligman had this epiphany. And the epiphany was, maybe I've been looking at mental health from the wrong angle. Instead of studying why people get depressed, maybe I should be studying why people don't get depressed. Why do people have good mental health? Why do they have, and he used the term, resilience. So he then spent the late 80s, 90s, 2000s studying this. I was lucky enough in 1991 to buy one of his pivotal books called The Optimistic Child. I had my first child in 1993. Much to my wife's horror, my kids were all raised with Seligman's model of learned optimism. And it's a very challenging way. It's where, you go out and you take your daughter out onto a tennis court, and, she's 6, 7 years old, and she hits the ball 5 times and misses it 5 times, and she says, Dad, I'm just no good at this. And as Seligman says, what you have to say is, you're right, you're not good at this. But you shouldn't expect to be good at this. This isn't a skill we're born with. This is a skill we have to practice. And if you practice and you work, and you put in the time, you'll get better. And Seligman really got people to understand, if you want to build resilient people, you want to build optimism, you have to build them internally. You can't build them externally. You have to build the internal framework to where they see themselves as the person who can solve the problems. So when they're stuck with a problem or they're trapped, they don't accept being trapped as a fate, but they see being trapped as a position. And their next question is, what's my next maneuver? That's the concept of resilience that Seligman has really done so well on. And I encourage the book, The Optimistic Child, although it's 30 years old, it's still a great read. It was followed more in recent times, in about 2013, just before, well, actually around the time Seligman came out here as our thinker in residence, by probably his ultimate book called Flourish. And that is, how do we flourish in life? And we'll mention that in a little bit. The things that make you less prone to mental illness if you become unemployed: resilience and optimism lead the charge. Having good family and community support are vital. The idea of having a life outside of work, so when you lose work, you still have a life. And this goes to the concept of meaning and purpose in your life. If all you've done in this world is just worked and not lived, you're in trouble if you lose that job, because you don't see yourself as having any value to yourself or to anyone else. The negative of this is you can be optimistic and you can be resilient, but if the crisis persists and persists and persists, you can be ground down. And that is one of the important things to think about. Even the most optimistic and resilient people have their limits. And that sense of hopelessness can grow. One of the good things I would say about, I don't know if the previous speaker can, not well, so maybe you won't hear me. I think one of the positives of Job Keeper and Job Seeker for the first time was that people who were unemployed felt validated. They actually felt cared. It's not like they were completely marginalized. For the first time, the community said, well, look, we see you, we see your suffering, and we'd like to help. And I do think that had a profound impact upon how people who were unemployed kind of viewed themselves. And for the first time in their life, you actually saw them have almost a sense of pride that they hadn't had for a long, long time. Sadly, as we see that turned back and back, I think unfortunately we're going to see that slide back very quickly. The last thing I'd also say, as I'm coming to the very end now, one of the other difficulties I think that we've had with COVID that I personally have found frustrating, that really makes this time so much difficult compared to other times, is the complete shutting down of volunteer work, which most of us don't really appreciate. But that has been profound. The idea that if you had a sense of purpose, you weren't working, but you did volunteer work. Even if it was in things like working in an animal shelter, not with people, but, and you had that as a wonderful aspect to your life, that all got taken away. And I think we failed to underestimate how powerful a negative impact that has had upon the community. And then lastly, I'm just going to leave you with the model that Seligman had that is in one of the handouts. I've got a couple of handouts you can pick up. And this is a model called PERMA. So this is Seligman's model from his book Flourish. If you go on YouTube, you can just type in Martin Seligman, Flourish, and you'll actually see a number of his talks here from Adelaide. Seligman makes all of his materials pretty much freely available on the internet. He's not out to get rich, he's out to actually make the world a better place. And with his model PERMA, he talks about the idea of positive emotion. focus on things like optimism, that we need to engage in life, that we need to focus on building relationships, not just within families, but within communities, that we need to look for the meaning in our life. And that's so important. You know, one of the books on my recommended list is a book by Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist. He wrote the wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning. And in there, I'm going to paraphrase the quote really badly because I don't really know Nietzsche, the philosopher, that well. But Frankl uses one of his quotes: if you can help the man understand why live, then he will be able to work out how, no matter how tough the situation. But we really have to help people find out the why, the purpose, the meaning. And then lastly, the A, and that is the concept of you have things to look forward to. And this is the idea that you have goals in life. You have goals for the day, goals for the week. And this adds the concept of structure. And the last thing I'll just mention, as I was talking to Megan, we were talking about the idea of work and the importance of work for mental health, which is massive. I did come across one very interesting study that I mentioned to Meg the other night, and that was, there's one study that shows really crappy work is as bad for your mental health as being unemployed. So we shouldn't accept any job is a good job. Yeah, it's got to be one that does have value, does have purpose, or else, as the previous speaker said, really we're just torturing people, and that's no good for anyone. So look, probably at that point, I shall leave it. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Nick. And yes, let's always remember we're talking about the value of meaningful work. It's another thing that the COVID crisis has brought home to us, isn't it? The importance of caring work, and it's exposed some areas. Aged care obviously stands out as a very big example of areas which could do with a lot more workers. I would like to introduce Dr. Stephen Hale. Dr. Stephen Hale is a founding member of the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group. His book, Sustainable Prosperity, was published in 2018 and deals with the ideas that we can't really allow infinite growth on a finite planet, and that one of the most important challenges that we face today is living within our ecological means. And tonight, Stephen is going to be talking to us about a job guarantee, how we can provide meaningful work that cares for people and cares for the planet, and does so in an equitable way. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Meg. And thanks very much for that great talk. I was laughing a bit in the middle because I am 58. 58-year-old. Okay, well, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a job guarantee in the next few minutes. Where to start? Australia in the early 1970s had a Scandinavian level of inequality, as many of you will know. It also had full employment. We had full employment in this country from 1945 to 1975 continuously, as I'm going to show you briefly in a minute. The unemployment rate, when there was next to no underemployment, went above 2% marginally only once, and it was seen as so scandalous at the time that Robert Menzies almost lost the general election as a consequence of that. Following the energy crisis of the mid-1970s, we gave up on full employment. In Australia, we also gave up on inequality too. Inequality has had a trend to rise under both Liberal and Labour governments from the mid-1970s onwards, more or less continuously up until very recently. And underemployment, which had not existed at all really until about 1978 or 1979, had become more and more important. So that the best way of thinking about unemployment in Australia now is not with reference to the official unemployment statistic, which outside of a pandemic doesn't always look that terrible. It's with reference to the underutilisation rate, which includes people who are unemployed in the sense that they have no paid employment at all, but it also includes people who have some paid employment but not as much as they would want. We had less than 10% underutilisation, the way I think about unemployment. In Australia, the last time, in about 1980, actually twice since then, the national rate has been marginally, very, very briefly, below 10%, but at no stage since the early 1980s in South Australia have we had an underutilisation rate of less than 10%. So we gave up on full employment, and we gave up on focusing on inequality way back in those dim and distant days. Now we'd like to do something about this. We have, after all, a public option where education is concerned. If you've got children, those people that can afford it, not all of them take up this option, but you have an option. It's not an obligation. It's an option to use the public sector as far as their education is concerned. You also have a public option where healthcare is concerned. Again, it's not an obligation, but if you get very sick, we'll look after you in a government hospital. We don't have bullshit education in our schools because we are careful to ensure that that is not the case. And we inspect them to ensure that's not the case. We don't have bullshit healthcare in our hospitals. We maintain high standards within our hospitals. We don't have to have bullshit jobs in a job guarantee either, because that's what we want, a public option for employment in Australia, and we want quality jobs within that public option. This is a screen grab from Cassie O'Connor speaking in the Tasmanian Parliament on the 23rd of September. She was successful in passing a motion mandating the Tasmanian government to investigate what it would take to implement a job guarantee in Tasmania. Of course, we want a federal job guarantee, but this is just one amongst many steps on the way. And there is something with job guarantee-like characteristics. It's certainly not the world's first job guarantee program, which is being launched in Austria for people who are long-term unemployed at the moment. Some of the Jobs for Canberrans program, which was introduced as an emergency measure in the ACT this year, has aspects of a job guarantee, although it's not available to everybody. There have been a number of bills laid before Congress in the US in the last few years, including this one of Cory Booker, the Job Guarantee Development Act, and you notice one of the co-signatories for that bill is the new Vice President of the USA. Without the Democrats being in the majority in the Senate, I don't think we're going to get a job guarantee, but almost every serious Democratic candidate other than the new president was an advocate of a job guarantee during the recent campaign, including his Vice President. So we'll just have to see what happens, I guess. Now, I talked about us having had effectively 10% unemployment, using the measure of unemployment I think is relevant or above, for 40 years in Australia. In the UK, after the First World War, in the 1920s, they went a decade before the Great Depression of having 10% unemployment as well. And this is what Keynes said in an article he wrote for the leader of the Liberal Party, the former Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, in 1929. The belief, this is widely shared belief. It was a bit, Keynes' writing was a little bit sexist, so I've changed a few things. The belief that there's some law of nature. And people do talk about a natural rate of unemployment. Economists have done that for the last 50 years, we've used that kind of language. The belief that there's some law of nature which prevents people from being employed, that it's rash to employ people, and that it's financially sound to maintain a tenth of the population in idleness, which is what we've done in South Australia for 40 years, for an indefinite period, is crazily improbable. The world's best ever economist. The sort of thing which, and I think this very often about some of my, not in my university in particular, but my colleagues in my profession, The sort of thing which no one could believe who had not had their head fuddled with nonsense for years and years and years. There's nothing natural about involuntary unemployment, underemployment, or insecure employment, and we didn't used to have it. At the end of the Second World War, you might be familiar, some of you, with the fact that we had a full employment white paper in Australia. The government took on the responsibility of ensuring that there was no involuntary unemployment in Australia. There was something similar in the UK and other countries as well. The US president put forward a Bill of Rights. It was never actually passed, which included the right to decent employment. It's in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23.1. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favourable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. And look, we did it. I come across many young economists, including very famous economists in Australia, who are amazingly completely unaware of the country's economic history as far as the... Not that there were lots of things that were terrible about Australian universities, of course there were, but unemployment wasn't one of them. Involuntary unemployment wasn't one of them. And down the years, there you are, you can see the peak in 1962, just above Bob Menzies there, and you can see what went wrong. Well, in the mid-1960s, there was an American economist called Hyman Minsky who came up with what he called an employer of last resort program, what we now call the Federal Job Guarantee Program. Minsky said there are changes going on in societies like the US and Australia, which means that the tactic we've used since the Second World War to maintain full employment, which is just to keep spending more, going for more and more growth, would lead to bigger and bigger problems with inflation and financial instability. And these days, we'd say a focus on economic growth is just something we have to get away from for ecological reasons. And we also say, as Minsky might have said in the 1960s, that when there is a major shock, if you don't have a job guarantee in place, if you don't have a safety net for people, then you'll live with the consequences of mass, prolonged unemployment. And this is what we've had since in Australia. We had the rise of insecure employment, we had the rise of underemployment at the end of the 1970s, and which you can see, as I said, as far as the national underutilisation rate is concerned, it's gone marginally below 10% only twice in that entire period. What a terrible waste of human potential, and in a country where there are many things that we could be doing for each other and for our environment. It's a terrible waste of a resource. We've got far too many things for people to be doing which are worthwhile for us to tolerate such a high level of underutilisation, plus, of course, the impact that insecure employment, underemployment and unemployment has on people's well-being, both their psychological well-being and their physical well-being as well. Just to add another statistic to what we heard earlier, in the Lancet a couple of years ago, there was an article indicating that 1 in 5 suicides around the world is associated with unemployment. Well, we don't have to put up with it. There's nothing natural about it. And as part of a Green New Deal, we first of all ought to be restoring the public sector, because the share of total employment in our public sector in Australia has been falling for years and needs to be restored to where it once was. There are many things we need to bring back into the public sector: get rid of the Job Active Network, reinstitute the Commonwealth Employment Service. But of course, we need a wider variety and better public services to be made available in the future than the past as part of the Green New Deal. Now, this is part of a full employment commitment, but it's not part of the job guarantee. The job guarantee is a relatively small programme under normal circumstances that fits within a full employment commitment. So when we talk about the job guarantee being at a minimum wage, or if it may be negotiated with the unions, it may be at the public sector level 1 wage, we are not talking about high-skilled jobs and undercutting people who are in those jobs at the moment. We are talking about entry-level jobs, transition jobs. Nonetheless, you know, jobs, if we are involved in community gardening or or weeding, or planting trees, or providing help and companionship to people who are stuck at home or the elderly, we might choose to do that on that low-level wage. I'd be quite happy to live on $40,000 if I was free to do the writing that I would like to do under those circumstances. So the job guarantee, yes, it is about providing help for those people who are always at the end of the queue as far as jobs are concerned when the economy recovers. We never get to the front of the queue, actually, because we get scared if unemployment gets too low. In Australia, the Reserve Bank starts putting interest rates up. The natural rate of unemployment they now call the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. We don't talk about a non-accelerating inflation rate of illiteracy, do we? Or a non-accelerating inflation rate of heart disease. Why should we talk about a non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment? It's just about getting the institutions right to ensure that nobody is involuntarily unemployed, and that those people who choose the right, because it's a right, not an obligation, to be involved in socially useful employment and be recognised for that by being paid, they should have that option. Now, when you explain this to people, it's incredibly popular. These are 3 different surveys. The one on the left is from Unions New South Wales. I just reproduced a page from one of their reports this year, which indicates the vast majority of people think, when it's explained to them, that a federal job guarantee is a good idea. You don't have to choose between the two, but their survey also showed there's about twice as many people that would prefer a job guarantee to a UBI if they had to choose between the two when you survey them. The top right-hand corner, there's a survey that Get Up commissioned, which indicates that there is majority support for a federal job guarantee amongst people who vote for all political parties in Australia. It's not a particularly left-wing idea. Liberal voters, Greens voters, they might be thinking about it from a different perspective, but when you explain the federal job guarantee, people are in favour of it. There is a US survey from last year up there which also indicates, well, basically the vast majority of both men and women are in favour of a federal job guarantee as a policy, and there is no statistically significant difference between the genders as far as this preference is concerned. I won't talk in detail about how to organise a job guarantee now. I will just, because I don't want to keep people from eating for long, I'll just say that we have had plans for years that have been discussed with people with considerable experience in public administration. There are MMT economists, as Meg mentioned modern monetary theory, I think a couple of minutes ago, who've been talking to people recently who more or less overnight introduced the Jobs for Canberrans scheme. We could do this. It is not beyond our wits to do this. There is a job guarantee in India which has up to 50 million people participating in it each year. We probably, in a non-pandemic period, only have 500,000 in ours. We really ought to be able to organise something like this if we set our mind to it. Something else that they did at the University of Newcastle 12 years ago was to survey 50% of all local councils in Australia. They got a 50% response rate. Basically what they were asking for was, if there was no problem with the funding, could you come up with some ideas about jobs which would be locally useful, that would be of social value, which people could carry out if they were employed within a job guarantee. And they were not short of ideas. And this is not an exhaustive list, though. And when large-scale job guarantee programs have been introduced around the world, I'm going to quickly mention one in Argentina before finishing in a moment. There have been ideas which have been actually proposed by groups of unemployed people themselves, which have worked very nicely within the job guarantee. And on the left-hand side there's a chart relating to the New Deal in the US in the 1930s, just to indicate that in the 1930s in the US, They employed artists, and they had educationalists, and writers, and researchers, including a young Hyman Minsky, who I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, working within the New Deal programme. Obviously, that's not going to be the main element of it, but the limit in terms of what you do in a federal job guarantee is really just your imagination. There's been a terrific book. There's a copy of that book on the front desk called The Case for a Job Guarantee, which a friend of Phil and mine, Pavlina Tcherneva, the American Economist, has brought out this year. And within it is explained things which ought to be obvious, really. Unemployment isn't generally the fault of the unemployed. Of course it's not, especially when you're running your economy on the basis you have to have at least 5 or 6% unemployment at all times, otherwise you're worried about inflation. People sometimes talk about low productivity workers in the job guarantee. Well, if the alternative is to be unemployed, this is my first answer to that statement, the job guarantee jobs don't really have a very high productivity hurdle to meet. And they're not supposed to be profitable anyway. You're not selling anything to anybody. A job guarantee that I had anything to do with wouldn't have any private sector involvement at all, except perhaps cooperatives. And the job guarantee should contribute to the welfare of participants, and there should be, of course, training available within the job guarantee, but it should never be compulsory. Again, it's an option, it's not an obligation. And to non-participants as well, of course. When people talk about there not being enough jobs in the economy in the future for everybody to work, well, while some of us enjoy the opportunity of paid employment, it's very unhealthy to think about a future society where there are others are just seen as consumption machines, where they're not given that opportunity to contribute in the respect which comes along with it. The job guarantee should help to stabilise an unstable economy. That's what Hyman Minsky used to say. Spending on the job guarantee will automatically shrink as the demand for labour in the rest of the economy expands, as the economy recovers. It grows in a downturn. It's there automatically, without public servants having to forecast anything in advance. It's there to deal with economic shocks when they happen. If there's a pandemic, well, okay, it might not be safe anymore to be engaged in the activities you'd normally be engaged in within a job guarantee, but your job would be to stay at home until it was safe under those circumstances. There wouldn't be queues outside any offices anywhere of people who were terrified about being unemployed. They'd just enter guarantee if that's what they chose to do. It means spending where, when and on whom the spending needs to go. It supports local communities, including remote communities where there might otherwise be a shortage of jobs. It injects income into those communities which will help to support jobs outside the job guarantee. As I said, it's a voluntary public option for those who are not in full-time employment and who want paid work. And I think it was Richard asked me about Argentina. So I'm not going to use what do I know about Plan Jefes. Pavlina was one of the people that helped to design it. As you might be aware, Argentina's economic crisis before the last one exploded at the end of 2001. And there was almost a revolution. There were people on the streets demanding jobs. And more or less overnight, Argentine economists took the ideas of Pavlina Tcherneva and Bill Mitchell in Newcastle and a few other economists and tried to implement them, albeit with a very limited budget. It was originally called Plan Jefes de Hogar. That stands for male heads of households. However, 3/4 of the participants in the plan were female, so they had to change the name to Plan Jefes de Hogar. It ran between 2002 and 2006. I won't, because we're a bit short of time, I won't read through all that there, but apart from to say that more or less overnight, they got this organised with nearly 2 million participants at the peak. As it says there, this was equivalent to 13% of the labour force within 3 months being absorbed into a successful, albeit limited, employment job guarantee. Not everybody had access to it. As it says there, to be eligible, the household had to have children under 18, persons with disabilities or a pregnant woman, and then only one member of the household was allowed to enter the programme. Pavlina and Randy Ray, when the programme was brought to an end, which it was in 2006 because it was seen as an emergency measure wrongly, and the economy had recovered strongly by then, and also because of there being 3/4 female participation, and there was strong opposition to that from the Roman Catholic Church because it was transforming in low-income areas the role of women in society. So they scrapped it and introduced something like a basic income instead in 2006. Turns out this wasn't a popular move. Pavlina and Randy interviewed lots of people and they gave them 6 options for what they liked the most about the programme, and in 5th place, can I get an income from? In 1st place was a purpose. I can do something useful in the community. The scheme had shrunk a lot as the economy recovered, as it's supposed to do. That's the number of people in the programme. Peaking soon after the programme was implemented and then shrinking again as the economy recovered in what was one of the most successful periods in the modern economic history of Argentina. They should never have scrapped the programme. Now, I know some people are very attached to the idea of a UBI, and I am attached to its aims. It addresses some of the same issues as a job guarantee. Obviously, it's possible to argue for both. When people talk about a UBI, if it's a genuine UBI, it has to go to everybody, absolutely everybody. And if it's a genuine basic income, it has to be enough to live on and not live in poverty. My problem with a UBI is it doesn't address all the non-financial costs of unemployment. It wouldn't be counter-cyclical, like a job guarantee is. And while, of course, you can pay for it, that's one of the things modern monetary theory economists won't disagree with you about. In order for it to be non-inflationary, you need to rewrite the whole tax system. So I am in favour, because I very strongly believe that a job guarantee should be an option, not an obligation, of a guaranteed basic income, but not a universal basic income. I wouldn't be sending any cheques to Clive Palmer or if it was down to me. Finally, or more or less finally anyway, pre-pandemic, that's the long-term unemployed people in Australia. And remember what the government was telling us in January 2020. How many years had it been since we'd had a recession, according to them? 18 years? And yet we had 170,000 people in this country who had been unemployed for longer than a year, and it wasn't their fault. They just happened to be at the end of the queue. And we just happened to abandon them. And you don't have to listen to people like me saying these kind of things. I like this quote from Peter Strong of the Council of Small Business Organisations. We are creating millionaires on the back of the long-term unemployed by paying providers to offer a failed service. The people that win are the service providers, not the unemployed or the employers. The whole system needs to be turned on its head. And I particularly like this bit, although I stress that these are not my words. A message for laissez-faire economists who've been in charge for the last 40 years, really. You're a bunch of shallow intellects who failed all of us due to your lazy pomposity. In other words, we should be giving people the legal right to employment. It's a right which you can throw away if you're persistently disruptive, but it should be, for most people, a right to avoid involuntary unemployment, as it effectively was between 1945 and 1975 in a very different society. I think that the Economic Bill of Rights that Roosevelt put forward soon before his death and was never implemented is not a bad guide. Obviously it needs to be updated for some of the rights we should be offering people now. We should be offering people the right to a useful remunerative job, amongst many other rights, as part of our Green New Deal, in our new equitable and sustainable economy that we need to have in place by 10 years from now, if not much sooner than that. So we're pushing for this. Push. That's an acronym that I stole from a South African AIDS campaigner years ago. Persist until something happens. Some of you will have noticed that's why I might look a bit older than 58 these days, because I've been doing that for a long time. Persist until something happens. People are just beginning to listen. So we're now pushing governments. No one was interested before. As far as First Nations groups are concerned, Noel Pearson, of course, from the Cape York community, is one of the main advocates for a federal job guarantee in Australia these days. Yes, we're pushing the Greens. It's nice to see a couple of Green politicians here. We are pushing very hard branches of the ALP, because much though I'd love to see a federal Green government, it's not that likely in the immediate future. We are pushing unions. Gabby and I will be seeing some trade union leaders tomorrow morning, in fact. And we're pushing everybody else too. And now we just wait for everyone in the world to change their mind. Some of them are a bit slow to change their mind. They used to say it was a ridiculous idea. Then, especially in the US, they call it communism. You'd explain, well, under normal circumstances, maybe 2% of GDP might go on the job guarantee. What about the other 98%? It's not exactly communism. And then they say, hang on a minute, what about all the people in the crappy jobs at the moment? They won't be forced to stay in those crappy jobs if you give them something else to do with decent pay and working conditions. And that's really what we're up against now. Very powerful interest groups who really would, as an economist called Michal Kaleski explained, a problem about achieving and maintaining full employment in the 1940s. He said, we know how to do it, but the trouble is there are very powerful people who don't want you to have an alternative, to being desperate for that minimum wage job with terrible working conditions. This, amongst other things, will empower people. It will force employers to give people decent working conditions. And I'm someone that's run a struggling small business myself in the distant past. It will make life more difficult sometimes, you have to be honest about it. But if you can't offer people what is seen by society as a minimum acceptable wage, well, of course we have a statutory minimum wage now, but with decent working conditions, then your business really isn't viable. And that's just, you just have to be honest about these things sometimes. And that's it as far as the talk is concerned. Thanks very much.